So I recently finished a full watch through of the G1 Transformers cartoon. This has been a goal of mine since I got back into collecting, and in this video I'm going to talk about that whole experience, the highs and lows, how it holds up after 40 years, that's the last time I watched it, and who knows, maybe even inspire you to do a full rewatch yourself. But first up, let me say this is not going to be entirely a love fest. I enjoy Transformers, particularly collecting the figures, but I'm not one of those fans who laps up everything just because it's part of the canon, or because other people tell me that I should. I'm also not going to give the series a pass because it's 40 years old, or even because it was made for kids. In my opinion, kids' shows deserve the same level of scrutiny as any other media. If a show fails its audience, then that's a problem, whether they happen to be 5 or 50. This is all a long-winded way of saying if you're someone who doesn't like criticism when it comes to your favourite media, or thinks the definition of a fan is someone who swallows everything blindly without complaint, then this isn't going to be a video for you. This video is intended for a mature audience that understands the difference between a fondness for the brand and blind adoration. That being said, my overall feeling after watching all of Season 1 was that I didn't adore it, but I definitely admired what the creators were able to achieve. They do a great job of introducing the world and its core concepts in an accessible and visually appealing way for its young audience. It's worth taking a step back, I think, and considering the task in hand at the time. A range of toys had been introduced to the market with a backstory and short blurbs detailing each of the characters, but nothing had been fleshed out. It was also, unlike G.I. Joe, which came a little before, a science fiction concept where the main protagonists are not human. This immediately presents a problem in terms of relatability and readability. By readability I mean, when you look at a Transformer, do you understand what it's thinking or feeling? If they simply took the toy designs and reproduced them on screen, then probably not. The Ratchet and Ironhide toys stand out as fairly inscrutable examples of this. And we do know that it doesn't quite work from early issues of the comic where they attempted it. So the first thing the creators did was wisely humanize the Transformers across the board for the cartoon. Autobots and Decepticons alike get a makeover so their expressions are obvious and their body language translates to something that even the most emotionally stunted 6-year-old could understand. I'm talking about really basic things here, like when they get injured, do they fall down in the same way a human would? They gesture with their hands, they grimace when unhappy, and smile where appropriate. It sounds like such a basic point, but if this hadn't been done, the show would have been off to a much rockier start. It's easy in hindsight to think this was a foregone conclusion, but it wasn't. Nothing was in 1984. The concept of turning an existing toy line into a cartoon was new, and there was no real proven roadmap. Similarly, the introduction of the core dilemma for the Transformers is easy to understand and an example of economical storytelling. After a short voiceover detailing the ongoing war, we see Wheeljack and Bumblebee scavenging for energy, then attempting to return to base pursued by Decepticons. This scene is essentially the plot of the entire first season in microcosm. Neither faction has the resources it needs to defeat the other, and the search for new sources of energy underpins much of what happens. Getting philosophical for a second, you could also say this is the theme of Transformers as a whole, power, both literal and figurative, and what a person or a people will do to secure it. Megatron goes on to demonstrate that he will do anything. He will trample over anyone, while the more benign Autobots are willing to set aside their immediate need for the sake of a native population that's brought into conflict because of them. In the final episode of the 3-part pilot, More Than Meets the Eye, the selflessness of Optimus and crew is rewarded when the governments of the world provide them with enough fuel to return to Cybertron and revitalize the planet. This is a fitting conclusion and provides a moral for the story that elevates proceedings above a running battle, but it's also where my first criticism comes in, since the rest of the season is basically this plot on repeat, minus the satisfactory conclusion. The Decepticons continue to hunt for energy as if the first 3 episodes never happened, and the Autobots foil them on a weekly basis, because at this point the show is greenlit for further episodes, and syndication is the ultimate goal. In the United States at the time, shows needed to reach a certain number of episodes, at which point they could be sold to other channels for repeat broadcast. They didn't know whether that was going to happen for the first story arc, so they tied that off with a nice bow, but it becomes more open-ended as more shows are produced. There are a couple of recurring threads that run through the first season, such as the Decepticons' attempts to construct a space bridge for travel to and from Cybertron, the introduction of the Dinobots, a high point for many fans since these were some of the coolest toys, There is also the three-parter The Ultimate Doom, in which Megatron decides, instead of shuttling resources from Earth to Cybertron, to bring Cybertron to Earth. But by and large, the episodic nature of the show hinders character development and story progression. Everything must be reset at the end of each episode, since shows in syndication were often broadcast out of order, so long-running plot lines just wouldn't track. Weirdly, or possibly not, since the whole point of the show is to sell toys, the one area where things do move on is in the cast list, as old toys are retired and new ones come to the fore. This really ramps up in later seasons, but we see the beginnings of it in Season 1 with the Dinobots, then Devastator taking centre stage. Jetfire is also introduced, renamed Skyfire due to rights issues. I'm conflicted about the fact that the introduction of these new characters is both a high point, breaking up the stream of episodes in which basically the same thing happens, the search for energy, just the trimmings around it change, and a low point since it foregrounds the series' fairly cynical roots. The rules regarding advertising to children had been lifted, allowing brands like Hasbro to hit us with a show like Transformers in the first place. Was I truly enamoured with the story and the characters, or simply being manipulated into nagging my parents for the latest edition of the cast? The truth is both. And I don't think there's any reason it can't be both. Business concerns often drive artistic endeavour. Shakespeare wrote at the behest of wealthy benefactors, and while I'd never accuse Transformers of being high art, it does manage to weave a story and compelling characters out of what is essentially a sales pitch. But I'm an adult now with an adult's attention to detail, and so I'm applying that to everything I see as I commence this rewatch. When the Insecticons are introduced in episode 15, A Plague of Insecticons, my adult mind is suddenly alive with questions. If they landed in an escape pod before the others, what have they been doing for millions of years? Just hanging out in this swamp, waiting for hapless canoeists to paddle by? How are they able to sustain themselves eating vegetable matter? If some Transformers can do this, why can't others? And what's the point of Megatron's shenanigans in the first place? All he needs to do is lay down his cannon and take up farming. Most Transformers, when they're first introduced, are overpowered, but the Insecticons' abilities seem wildly out of whack. Being able to generate an army of clones, control foes remotely, or conduct lightning. How and why are they so powerful? Did these questions mar my enjoyment as a kid? No, I honestly can't remember noticing them. Do they mar my enjoyment as an adult? Not really, since I know it's a show designed for kids and I just have this inexplicable attachment to it. Does it alter how we assess the cartoon in relation to others of the time though? Yeah, I think that's a fair question, and Transformers, whilst not the worst Saturday morning kids cartoon, it's not the best either. There are too many animation errors and logical inconsistencies, things dangling plot threads, contradictions, for it to be considered a shining example of the format. I can think of much better cartoons from the time. But it's saved, in my opinion, by its roster of intriguing characters and a willingness to incorporate some big ideas. The first episode after the three-part introduction, Transport to Oblivion, reveals that the Decepticons are constructing a space bridge. I wonder for how many of the show's young audience this was the first time they'd encountered an idea like this. Star Trek and other sci-fi shows were numerous, but there's a first time for everyone, and the makers of the cartoon couldn't assume the audience knew what they were talking about. They do a good job of hand-holding the viewer, even though the concept of a blinking donut that sucks its contents through a wormhole in the sky is much more complicated than the literal suspension bridge depicted in the comic. The sequence of shots leaves little room for confusion as to what's happening, and the plot of the episode, as Spike is used as a test subject, adds additional jeopardy. Throughout Season 1, it's notable how many characters demonstrate abilities they would never use again, and there are a few notable examples in this episode. Megatron has a snake-like probe that extends from his chest, allowing him to alter Bumblebee's memories, and Ratchet can fire a net from his wrist that traps Laserbeak. Starscream fires both concussion blasts,
a concussion blast!
And then his null ray.
My null ray will stop your squirming for a while.
What's the difference between these two things? Is there any? I definitely get the feeling that by the start of Season 2, a lot of these finer details were dropped as the writers got to grips with what is important to point out and what isn't. Episode 5, Roll For It, sees the introduction of another human ally for the Transformers in the form of Chip. a wheelchair-bound science whiz who's been working on an antimatter formula that Megatron has coincidentally identified as yet another means of attaining ultimate power. Some of the Autobots' abilities feature heavily in the first season, with Mirage's invisibility and Hound's holographic projections being obvious examples. In this case, in combination, they allow Prime and Co to slip by the Decepticons. Here the show runs into the same problem all fantasy and science fiction shows do when they incorporate impressive abilities like these. Basically, why don't the characters use them all the time? Why isn't there an episode where Prime sends an invisible Mirage into Decepticon headquarters to plant a bomb and blow them all to hell? It's not a problem unique to Transformers, as I say, and overall, this is a pretty fun episode for me, mainly due to the introduction of Chip. Surely a conscious decision to add a proxy for the audience that makes the point you don't have to be the physically strongest person to make a difference. And of course the moment where he takes control of Prowl is a good one. Did you know the Autobots had battle computers? I certainly didn't, and it's hardly a surprise you don't, since it's never mentioned. Again, nothing ever happens like it. Worthy of note though, networked computing was in its infancy at this time, yet they set Chip up with a remote link to the science lab and he's able to remotely control Prowl. Did the average viewer just accept this apparent technological miracle? Was it pure science fiction, or were the writers well ahead of their time? Answers on a digital postcard, or electronic mail if you would prefer. But let's put the brakes on. I don't just want this video to be a plot breakdown of all the episodes. I'm interested in talking about the experience of rewatching something after all this time. What was I thinking and feeling by this point? One revelation was the fact that I had never seen several of the episodes. I was largely informed by the reruns I could glimpse on British television. I may have recorded some to VHS to rewatch, I can't remember. I'm pretty sure I had this VHS release of the Key to Vector Sigma and War Dawn, and I think I had Megatron's Master Plan as well, because that one rang many bells during this rewatch. I've always been a Transformers fan and have been aware of the various iterations ticking away in the background, but the last time I watched a G1 episode before this rewatch, I was probably 8 or 9. The majority of my adult life, until I started collecting again about 3 years ago, Transformers have not loomed large in my psyche. They were fond and happy memories, and so rewatching the whole of G1 has been a process of rediscovery for me. I found myself zeroing in on interactions between the characters, such as this moment in Transport to Oblivion where Ironhide is injured and ends up on Ratchet's repair table. How the two interact with each other. You get a clear sense of their personalities. Ironhide is the grumpy guy, he doesn't want help, and Ratchet has this Autobot equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath. He's going to help whoever needs it. I wanted to understand how I came to feel so familiar with them and whether their personalities still resonated today. And they do. But what I didn't realise at the time is that they function so well not because they're particularly original, but because they draw on established archetypes. You can come up with 1 or 2 sentence descriptions for all of the Transformers in much the same way Bob Budiansky did for the toys. The fact that those hastily written outlines translated so well to the screen is a testament to the various writers' combined skill, but also the strong foundation provided by this type of archetypal storytelling. It's exactly the same thing going on in Star Wars: the innocent farm boy who yearns for adventure, the cynical scoundrel with a heart of gold, the plucky princess, the wise old sage, but in Transformers across a much broader sweep of characters. Let's see if you can guess the Season 1 Transformers from these descriptions. The hot-headed scout, who often bites off more than he can chew. The conflict-averse soldier, who nevertheless does what must be done. The grizzled old veteran, loyal and dependable. The thrill-seeking but self-absorbed show-off. The grumpy old stoic. Between the animation models, the voice acting, and the things the characters say and do, all of them end up distinct in one way or another, and this is no small feat given that by the end of the whole series the cast list must be in the hundreds. I would be lying, however, if I said I found the series endlessly engaging. There were episodes that were a slog to get through, and I don't think I'm someone who could sit down to watch the show purely for entertainment value. My adult brain, it just won't let me do that anymore. It's a show for kids and 80s kids, so to expect it to thoroughly entertain me as a 21st century adult would be unreasonable. What really kept me going when the plot started to lose me a bit was the prospect of discovering more forgotten moments. This is what I've decided to call Retrospective Archaeology. It's my video, I can call things what I want. Retrospective Archaeology is the act of returning to a vaguely remembered form of media in order to unearth forgotten details, and it was this carrot that kept me going through those more pedestrian episodes, such as episode 6, Divide and Conquer, in which Optimus gets injured, then gets injured a bit more, then spends the episode lying down. I don't think even 7-year-old me was particularly concerned for Prime. We'd seen him injured and get better before, and if it were not for a sojourn to Cybertron to visit Wheeljack's workshop and an acid rain shower, the episode might be a skippable one. Even still, there are moments that stand out, such as this blurry, almost POV shot as Optimus struggles to remain conscious. It's such an atypical visual flourish that it feels like the artist just snuck it in under the radar. But the highlight is, of course, the appearance of additional Cybertronian Seekers in green and yellow. What does this say about me that I'm so excited by a trio of nameless coloured triangles? Basically that I'm still a sucker, I think, and now I need examples of those for my collection. Spoiler alert, Optimus gets better at the end. Episode 7, Fire in the Sky, is an interesting one, not only due to the introduction of the mysterious Skyfire, but because Megatron's plan to tap the Earth's core for heat energy results in a global deep freeze that gives the episode this very distinct look. Everything is covered in snow and ice throughout. It's also pleasing that this leads directly to the discovery of Skyfire. The two things are interlinked. When plot and character dovetail together, it's always pleasing, and Skyfire is a genuinely intriguing character. We even get some background on Starscream's past, and by extension the past of Cybertron. They were out scouting together apparently. And I think I'm right in saying the war wasn't happening at that time, so Autobots and Decepticons were sending scouts out to just kind of chart the universe. You'd have thought he might have mentioned that one of those planets they scouted happened to be Earth, but being charitable, that was millions of years ago, and maybe he's forgotten, or he was hiding the fact in the hopes that it might give him some advantage over Megatron. It occurs to me now, because I'm just inventing headcanon at this point, he might have been hoping to find Skyfire without Megatron knowing. If he could convince Skyfire to support his claim to leadership, that would have given it some real clout. Whatever the case, Skyfire's introduction is mysterious, as I say, and I remember feeling that he was different to the other Autobots. Not just because he was a huge and expensive toy, it was something to do with his ambiguous nature in this episode. Even though by the end his true nature is revealed, the fact that he sacrifices himself for the others and returns to his tomb of ice further adds to his mystique. This is what I mean about the episodes where new toys are introduced being some of the best. They knock the plot lines off those predictable tracks. Megatron wants energy, Optimus stops him getting energy. Tapping the Earth's heat energy becomes the B plot, and Skyfire's true nature, that becomes the A plot. Coincidentally, the introduction of a bunch of jets towards the end of Season 2 leads to one of the best episodes also. So I do think it's not just me making this up. New characters give the writers license to focus on something other than Megatron's ceaseless search for energy. Likewise, episode 8, S.O.S Dinobots, is another new character episode that serves as a breath of fresh air. The introduction of the Dinobots is pretty random. The discovery of a bunch of fossils simply gives Wheeljack the idea to create new Autobots. This breaks the canon that would be established later when we learn Vector Sigma is the only one who can imbue Transformers with life. But since this is broken later in Season 3 when Grimlock creates the Technobots, I suppose we can just pick and choose what canon we decide to give credence to. They spring to life whenever a new product hits the shelves. To hell with the established lore. The decision to make the Dinobots a threat not only to the Decepticons but to the Autobots as well, due to their limited mental capacity, is a good one, I think. It's an entertaining one. It also frames them as a sort of Autobot A-bomb, the ultimate weapon. They can and are used in key moments to turn the tide, but the viewer and the Autobots are always a bit nervous about it. They never know what the repercussions might be. They could go off at any time and do something crazy. Why are they so stupid in the first place? That's a question that occurred to me. I suppose we could apply more headcanon here and say that because they were created by Wheeljack and not Vector Sigma, their intelligence was somehow limited. Mainly though, I think it's to do with the rather condescending way dinosaurs were portrayed back in the 80s. Big dumb lizards, essentially. And we'd have to wait for Steven Spielberg and Jurassic Park for that wrong to be righted in the popular consciousness. Episode 9, Fire on the Mountain, sees the return of Skyfire. Why did they bury him at the end of that episode in the first place, only to bring him back a couple of episodes later? I've never heard anyone confirm this, but I suspect it may have had something to do with those rights issues for the toy. Maybe they didn't think they could get them over the long term, and then that was sorted out later. He's unearthed to act as a sky taxi, essentially, and it seems fairly easy for the Autobots to excavate him, so why they didn't do this before now, I don't know. He's tasked with flying them to Peru, where Megatron has unearthed a crystal of power, although this is a misnomer since the power itself actually springs from beneath an Incan temple, the crystal itself acting like a shiny stopgap. The Decepticons appear to want it to regulate the energy, or perhaps focus it, as part of this roof-mounted laser, initially constructed poorly by the ever-frustrated Starscream. All getting a bit Freudian now. Whenever crystals are involved, things get complicated in Transformers, it seems. As far as I know, crystals have never served as a power source and are pretty much inert. Maybe the writers had been watching too much Star Trek and were thinking of dilithium. It's the portrayal of this non-white, non-Western culture that interests me in this episode. I think it's the first time it happens. They're fairly stereotypically portrayed, but it does mark the first time that Transformers go global. And on balance, I think that's a good thing, introducing young viewers to the notion that the Transformers story isn't going to be confined to their familiar backyard. I don't know why, but the moment when this young woman lectures her grandmother about the nature of the gods and then does a massive info dump really cracks me up. It's the look on her tired old face as she's being lectured to by this little kid. Deviating again from the recapping of episodes, this was another thing that kept me engaged: unintentional humour.
Autobots accelerate!
Whether triggered by a change in attitudes over the years to a certain demographic,
There's something in the water!
an animation error, or some lapse in logic, I did find the cartoon funny, and I have to believe some of it was intentional. This shot of Soundwave running away has to be designed for comic effect. He even snaps through a washing line at the end of it. It's a moment from a Charlie Chaplin film, or when Cliffjumper tries to tackle Megatron man on man and he just gets a slap. Does anyone sit down with a totally straight face to watch G1 Transformers? If you do, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. It's not how I approach it, but we all get different things from our favourite films and movies. I get comedy from Transformers a lot of the time. Episode 10, War of the Dinobots, is one of my favourites because it's all about character and for once ties in with a previous episode. The audience has been primed to be wary of the Dinobots' strength, but also their lack of intelligence, and Megatron is easily able to manipulate them into turning on Prime and the others. Seeing Optimus bested by one of his own troops is pretty interesting and gives the nerd in me something to chew upon, e.g. power levels. Nerds love discussing who's the strongest superhero, and it's the same thing with Transformers. And by the end of the episode, Grimlock is officially stronger than Prime and at this point the strongest Autobot. But the more important point is made. Strength is no guarantee of strong leadership. Grimlock and the Dinobots are motivated by self-interest throughout. Optimus is concerned with the well-being of others, and that's why he's in charge. It's also a new character episode, I'm telling you. I'm not making up, they are the best episodes. We get a nice little info dump about Snarl and Swoop's abilities before they're sent into action, just so everyone is clear why we desperately need these in our collection, and it's fun watching the other Autobots put them through their paces and get battered. The final shot is a great little button on the episode as Optimus and Grimlock shake hands, emphasising the importance of forgiveness. It's not subtle, nothing in Transformers is subtle, but it is an important lesson for children to learn, and unlike some episodes of He-Man, the moral grows out of the story. It doesn't feel tacked on. Episodes 11 through 13 are the series' second attempt at a story arc. The first part of the Ultimate Doom involves the kidnapping of Sparkplug to be used as a guinea pig for the sinister Dr. Arkaville's hypnochip. Did I say that with a straight face? I did. I'd actually confused this episode with an earlier episode of the comic, in which Sparkplug is kidnapped in order to devise a super fuel for the Decepticons. In rewatching this, I realised there's actually no reason why they target Sparkplug as the guinea pig here, and it's a pretty silly thing to do. If they just need a human, they're going to pick one of the humans that is ensconced in their enemy's base. Anyway, I don't want this to become a list of logical inconsistencies. That's not the point of rewatching Transformers. Let's just say there's plenty of them and move on. The central premise of the story, bringing Cybertron to Earth, is suitably epic for an arc like this one, and the fallout from the process gives the Autobots plenty to deal with: environmental disasters, brainwashed humans, and of course specifically Sparkplug, who must be saved. The writers do a good job of making sure there is personal jeopardy throughout these larger episodes. The moment where the Dinobots fight back against nature, though, is one that stuck with me since childhood. I think because it's a fairly intriguing concept. How do you stop a tidal wave? Well, you get the Dinobots to dig a massive ditch. Visually, things are suitably epic, with the final shot of Cybertron entering Earth's orbit, then hanging directly above the characters' heads as wind and debris swirl about them. It's particularly effective. The sky is always oppressively stormy, there are volcanoes and earthquakes to contend with, rain and high winds, so you definitely feel like the Earth is in crisis. There's no sign of what's going on in heavily populated areas, but we could hazard a guess that of all the episodes so far, this one has the highest body count. So that's fun. Megatron's plan to use this destruction as a means of generating energy makes about as much sense as any of his plans ever do, but it's the spectacle and the question of how to rescue Sparkplug, unbrainwash the humans, and send Cybertron back where it came from that really matter. Spoiler alert, they do manage it by the end, although Cybertron goes flying off through normal space, so it's a lot closer from now on. We get confirmation of this in the next episode as Starscream literally flies there in jet mode. There's no need for the space bridge anymore. It's the first real shake-up of the status quo with regards to the relationship between Earth and Cybertron, so things are kind of moving on in a tangential way. By this point in the series, most of the initial 84 toy line have been introduced, with one notable exception, the Constructicons. I was unaware that they didn't feature for the majority of Season 1, and was curious to see when and where they popped up in these final 3 episodes. Episode 14, Countdown to Extinction, was a pleasant diversion though, as the Autobots busied themselves about repairing the damage from the previous episode, so more continuity. There's actually a bit more than I give the show credit for. Megatron is even hellbent on settling his score with Dr. Arkeville. Starscream has other ideas, allying himself with the sinister scientist in an attempt to utilize his exponential generator, another world-ending device that is weirdly specific but also vague in its description and its function. An exponential generator that will build to infinite capacity, causing the Earth to erupt in a shower of free energy. None of that really means very much, apart from it's a big bomb that can potentially go boom, but it's the same trick that Star Trek pulls and other good science fiction. Overwhelm the audience with technobabble, so proceedings seem somewhat plausible, but don't get too specific and just have fun. I really like the dynamic between Starscream and Megatron. It's one of the few interesting relationships among the Decepticons. We do get flashes of others, like the altercation between Skywarp and Frenzy and Rumble at the start of this episode, but they mainly just squabble. The question of why Megatron keeps Starscream around when he's so obviously just waiting for the next chance to betray him continues to intrigue me to this day. We can always apply meta-knowledge, of course. You can't kill off a key character because you need him to market the toy, but I feel this relationship works because there are examples of it in real life. Think about the relationship between the American president and the vice president, or in the UK, the Prime Minister and our Chancellor. Often they will have been rivals within their own political party. The relationship can be a strained one. There's the old adage, keep your friends close but your enemies closer. Something like this could be going on with Megatron and Starscream. By the end of the first season, my explanation is this. Megatron needs Starscream for his abilities and his prowess, but also because he needs someone to butt up against him, so he can prove to the others why he's in charge. Starscream gives Megatron the opportunity to reassert his dominance in a very obvious, repeatable way without causing permanent damage, since to actually kill any of his troops wouldn't help his cause in the slightest. That's my theory. Starscream's power grab fails once more, and Optimus and Megatron play ball with the exponential generator before launching it into space. On occasion, the series does dally with the idea of them working together like this, but it never really lasts very long. I can imagine a version of G1 where their differences are more nuanced, more like the relationship between Magneto and Xavier in X-Men. A difference in approach rather than motivation. but that would require a complete reworking of the backstory and a much less trigger-happy Megatron. I was really hoping the recent Transformers 1 would play with this idea more, but it seems like by the end D16 is kind of the same old ruthless Megatron. Maybe not, maybe they'll surprise us in further installments. As we've already talked about episode 15, Plague of the Insecticons, that brings us to the final episode, Heavy Metal War, in which the Constructicons and Devastator finally make an appearance. It's a fitting end really. What could be more exciting than a group of robots that combine to form one big one? Remember, this is the first combiner team, and Western audiences were not as familiar with combining robots as Japanese audiences were, so this would have made an impact. It's interesting to learn about the Cybertronian version of a trial by combat, as Megatron challenges Optimus to see who may remain on Earth. Strange that it hasn't come up before now as an option, but it's a good excuse for a final confrontation between the two leaders. Of course, the really exciting climax is the one between Devastator and the Dinobots. Although it's nice too that a bit of trickery is employed here, with Hound's holograms providing enough of a distraction for Optimus to shoot Devastator in the belly. There's so much headcanon required for moments like this throughout the series. This one I've reconciled by telling myself Optimus knew exactly where to shoot. Although how he knew this requires further brain fiction, I've decided he'd fought the Constructicons before, basically. They were on Cybertron, hanging out with the Mega Supreme, we learn later. Anyway, finally, all the Decepticons fall into a fissure of lava, apparently defeated, but not really, and that's that. That's the end of Season 1 of Transformers. The first time I've watched it in 40 years, give or take. What were my feelings? First, I was glad I had done it. All the gaps in my knowledge and vague recollections had been filled in, and that was largely the point. But did this change my opinion of the series or Transformers as a whole? Was it as good as I remembered, or was my fondness for the cartoon purely a product of youthful innocence and now rose-tinted nostalgia? The nostalgia aspect can't be understated. I think a lot of why I enjoy Transformers is to do with the age I was when I first watched it. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing if we recognise that that is going on. I think kids now would maybe struggle with certain elements. They'd be struck by how crude the animation is, certainly, how slow the plot can be, how the action sequences don't really make sense at times. That final moment with Optimus shooting Devastator is a good example. Often something just happens so the battle can come to an end as the episode runs out of minutes in which to tell its story. But I'm also struck by how forward-thinking in some ways the series was and the concepts it tries to tackle, and I do think the creators did an amazing job of making the whole thing relatable and understandable for its audience. It was not an easy task. I'm bound to point to its closest rival, the GoBots, and how that cartoon largely failed where Transformers succeeded. We like and respect Optimus, we identify with Bumblebee, we fear Megatron and enjoy Starscream's antics as he tries to supplant him. Spike is a little bland at times, but that allows him to be an avatar for the viewer, giving us access into the Transformers world. I have to admit, though, that watching did sometimes feel like hard work. The closest analogy I can come up with is schoolwork, or writing a dissertation at university, something like that. You've got to read the book before you can write the essay. And even though on some level you might enjoy the characters and the story, it's still a chore that you're forcing yourself to do. If this seems sacrilegious to you as a Transformers fan, if you can't understand why someone can be a collector of Transformers yet not love the media with every fibre of their being, then I'm not sure what to tell you, except that I am a fan. I don't want you to doubt that. A fan that spends far too much money on the toys and spent far too much of my parents' money as a kid. And perhaps that's where my fandom lies, with the toys. As a child, the fiction was seasoning, but my imagination and the physical objects themselves were what I was mainly interested in. I remember picking up Gears at a toy store and drooling over the luxury item that was Optimus Prime, long before I saw the cartoon. It was the same with Star Wars. I saw my slightly older friend's collection. I was too young for it at the time, but I was immediately hooked, gathering information about the plot and the movie from him. Long before I saw the movie, I don't think I saw the original Star Wars in theatres. I saw it on VHS. This realization doesn't dampen my interest in continuing, however. In many ways, Season 1 feels like the taster before the real story begins. Season 2 having watched it now, I realise how much longer it is and broader in scope. It's also the series I remember most, having several episodes on tape back in the day, so I was looking forward to the process of Retrospective Archaeology continuing. Spoiler alert, even though season 2 was a lot longer, it quickly became something I was looking forward to at the end of each day, popping on the next few episodes as a means of relaxing before going to bed. In short, it engaged my adult brain far more effectively than the first season did, with the episodes focusing on fleshing out the Transformers universe and Cybertron's history being of particular interest to me. But I am getting ahead of myself here. You've probably already realised that I've decided to split this rewatch into parts because, truthfully, I want to see how this first video is received before I commit to doing that much longer season 2. I could easily stick with unboxings and top 10s on YouTube because longer videos like this one are much more of a time commitment and only really worth doing if people want to watch them. So if you've enjoyed this look at G1 Transformers and you want me to continue through the whole series, then please comment and let me know that. It's the way I decide what videos to do. That being said, I really appreciate you watching, particularly the people who've got to the very end. Thank you. I've been Napiet and hopefully I'll see you for season 2.